that is too much of a burden to put on Ontario taxpayers.
But how is it a burden if 90% of that money immediately gets returned to the very same people who just paid it?
That's the point. It doesn't go back to the same people who just paid it. It goes back to everybody,
right,
whether they did anything to combat climate change or not.
After 4 days of hearings, Ontario's court challenge of the federal carbon tax has wrapped. Now, 5 appeal court justices will decide whether or not it's constitutional to impose a carbon tax on a province. In the meantime, the Ontario government has launched an anti-carbon tax ad campaign to warn Ontarians of its cost.
With the federal government's carbon tax, you'll pay more for heating your home, for driving your kids to school, and for groceries.
Ontario also plans to display these anti-carbon tax stickers at every gas station in the province. The feds are calling the advertising misleading because they don't inform Canadians of the annual tax rebate they'll be getting. So how does Ontario feel about its court case, and how much money is this ad blitz costing taxpayers? Rod Phillips is the Ontario Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks. He joins us now from Toronto. Hi, Minister Phillips. Nice to see you again. Thanks for your time today.
Vashi, great to be with you this afternoon.
I want to start off with the court challenge because we saw it sort of proceed over the week, and there were challenges on both sides vis-a-vis the justices. But one justice in particular, Justice James McPherson, challenged the province's lawyers specifically and said, when you think about air pollution, the word, quote, Ontario sort of dissolves with the air. It's national and international. Is he wrong?
You know, actually, our arguments are really constitutional in nature, and they're really about the overreach that the federal government is clearly exhibiting with this bill. And, you know, I remind the viewers, I mean, we're not the only ones. There are, you know, now with the Alberta election victory, 3 of our fellow provinces also at court. And so, you know, the lawyers will make those arguments. Of course, our argument on the policy side and on the political side has been that we have a Made in Ontario plan that is taking the great work that's been done in Ontario already. I know I've had the chance to say on your show before, we're, you know, 75% of the way to the Prime Minister's reduction target, which is better than any other province. And we have a way to get that last 25% done without a carbon tax. So, you know, we'll let the lawyers make their arguments. We certainly understand that climate change is an issue, but our argument in the courts is that it's not constitutional for the federal government to intervene in this way. Our argument to the public is that it's an unnecessary tax that hurts families, and we are doing our part and have done our part and will. And I'm pretty sure that's what they're hearing from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick as well. And I suspect it's what they're going to hear from Jason Kenney.
With respect, Minister, though, that the target that you're talking about, it's not the Prime Minister's targets. In fact, your province changed the climate targets. They were more ambitious under Kathleen Wynne, and that is how, under that sort of calculation, is how the government established its own targets. So it's not necessarily, you're meeting the targets that you've set out, not the Prime Minister's targets, and that is essentially why they say that they need to impose this additional tax.
Listen, we understand, and the Prime Minister has made clear that he expects Ontario to do more than everyone else. But the reality, Veshi, is they, and I'm talking about the Minister of Environment and the Prime Minister, agreed to a 30% reduction from 2005 levels. That was the target we chose. You're not wrong that it's lower than Kathleen Wynne's target, but Kathleen Wynne's government was coming nowhere close to hitting that target. And frankly, they were imposing a tax that Ontario families couldn't afford and businesses couldn't afford. So, you know, we have made a decision. We made a decision to align ourselves with the targets that the Prime Minister established, targets that were agreed to in Paris in 2015, and we're well on the way to making them. And, you know, the Prime Minister, I mean, it's quite interesting this week, as you probably know, the national index that measures these things, it's a nonpartisan group, measured again the progress of each province. Interestingly, while Ontario continues to be a little bit over 22% in reductions, where the rest of Canada had increased emissions by 3%, that number's now gone to 6%. And if you look at the real details of that number, what's very interesting is some of the provinces that have cap and trade programs, like Quebec, or have carbon taxes, like BC, actually have seen emissions go up. So, listen, Ontarians want to do their share. The Prime Minister can try to convince us that we should do everybody else's, but we've got to protect our economy and our jobs as well.
That calculation, though, is based on 2017, I believe, when there was a cap and trade system in place in Ontario. And now your climate plan is different than that one. You have released a plan, but it's different. It's still, we don't know, for example, there's no guarantee that that will actually, that it will achieve as much, because there's still some of it to be determined to reach even the targets that you've set out.
Listen, yeah, absolutely. We are talking about a target 11 years in advance. But as you know, we've already released our emission standards program. We've already put forward our plans around ethanol. We've talked extensively about our Ontario Carbon Trust, which is a way to invest. We have looked at exactly ways that natural gas and renewable natural gas will be used. So it's a very specific plan. And frankly, I would ask the federal government, show us the plan. Show us the approach that they want to take to get to the targets that they agreed to. We have nothing to apologize for in Ontario for that plan. We're working on it. We're implementing it as we go ahead. And it doesn't involve a carbon tax that isn't necessary. And frankly, if you look at the last set of statistics, isn't working all that well in BC or in Quebec.
You mentioned your message not just to the courts, but to the public. And vis-a-vis that, you have launched radio ads, a sticker campaign. How much is that? I think your government calls it a public awareness campaign about the federal carbon tax. But how much is that campaign costing taxpayers?
Well, we are, you're right, following on the federal government, who have, of course, launched radio ads and sent out postcards and been running digital ads, and I'm sure you've asked the federal minister the same question about the costs. We were always transparent in our campaign. Well, and that's good. And I'll look forward to finding out what she said. But in our case, when we were running, we were very clear. Running to get rid of cap and trade and to get rid of to fight a carbon tax was something that we said we were going to use all the tools at our disposal. We talked then about as much as $30 million. Now, we have already talked today about the price of the stickers. That's $5,000. But remember, we want to make sure that Ontarians know we're going to defend Ontario's rights in the courts. We're using our own lawyers, not outside lawyers, so those costs won't be so high. And yes, we're not at all concerned. When you talk about the costs, just yesterday, I was out talking about the costs just for our OPP for fuel. $2 million additionally a year of cost just for fuel and OPP cars. So we've hospitals, $29 million of additional cost every year. So yes, we're going to have to use some government resources. I wish the federal government hadn't pushed us into this fight, but we're in it. And we think, I think this was a pretty important week in terms of what happened in Alberta. I think in terms of the court discussions, I think people were a bit surprised, frankly, with the strength of our arguments. Not that they should have been, but I think that they were. And of course, as I said, with the most recent science that shows that while Ontario continues to do well, the rest of Canada doesn't. It kind of makes you wonder, as one of the learned judges says, why don't you just leave them alone if they're doing such a good job? You did campaign against the carbon tax. You also said the taxpayers would be at the center of everything your government did. So I take your point that it's $10,000. I think you said $4,000. I'm sorry for the stickers. How much are the ads costing, and why can't you say? Yeah, we can't say. We're going to be transparent about it, just with the stickers. But remember, we've made a $1.2 billion tax cut by getting rid of that cap and trade program. This is about millions and millions of dollars, and we've absolutely been clear that we'll be transparent as the cost of these come. When we say foregone revenue, when you say foregone revenue, we say money in taxpayers' pockets. That's part of our objective. We want to make sure that that money goes back into their pockets because, Veshi, they need it. Life is very unaffordable in many parts of our province for a variety of reasons, including the cost that government put on people. So this is very aligned with the program that we ran on, and we will keep making this point. And, you've been kind enough to give me this platform before to talk about it, but $648 per family by 2022, that's a lot of money. And it's also $718 per family in rebates, though, and that's something your ad does not talk about. Well, and frankly, that's because almost no Ontarian I speak to believes that what the federal government is selling is what's going to happen. They're saying, we're going to tax you more, and then we're going to give you more money back. Now, actually, you know my problem with that. The whole point of a carbon tax is supposed to be that they're going to change behavior by taxing something, and that cost is going to cause people to change behavior. So tell me if those numbers they're saying are true, how they're going to tax people a certain amount of money, give them more money back, and then expect their behavior to change. It just doesn't match. And so most Ontarians I talk to become, and we could talk about British Columbia where emissions went up in the last measured group. So, yes, listen, we aren't saying that a carbon tax isn't something that some jurisdictions can use. I'm not about to tell other provinces how they want to fight climate change, but we have said how we'll fight climate change. If the Minister of Environment would sit down and go through our plan, she might find there's some things there that she likes, and she would find a willing partner in Ontario to try to make a difference. But instead, Instead, we are they're running their radio ads. They're making their point. They're sending postcards to everybody, and we're going to keep making our point because we think we're right on this. What they're doing is unconstitutional, but it's also unnecessary and it's bad for families.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Appreciate your time today. That's Minister Rod Phillips from the Queen's Park in Toronto.
Thanks, Veshy.
But over a 14-year period, Ontario emissions are down 22%.
Ontario has definitely achieved reductions, and largely through the closure of coal-fired emissions.
We don't care how they achieve it. They've achieved reductions of 22%. Why don't you just leave them alone?
It's not just Ontario that, as a country, we need to be worried about.
That was one of the federal government's lawyers defending the federal carbon tax in court this week. After 4 days of hearings, Ontario's constitutional challenge has now wrapped, and 5 appeal court justices will decide whether or not it's constitutional to impose a carbon tax on a province. So, is Ottawa confident about the case it made? Sean Fraser is Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and he joins us now from Halifax. Hi, Mr. Fraser. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I want to pick up where that clip left off. Justice James McPherson pointing out that Ontario has already reduced its emissions over a 14-year period, in large part because of the previous government's shuttering of coal-fired plants. But he wondered aloud, why not just leave them alone? Does he have a point there?
No, I couldn't disagree more strongly. The fact is, climate change is real, and we have to take serious action if we're going to avoid the most severe consequences. Relying on the record of a previous government to justify inaction today is completely unacceptable and counterintuitive to what most Canadians believe, which is we need to be doing more, not less, when it comes to action on climate change.
Is it really inaction, though? I mean, they are continuing with that part of the plan. They're reneging, obviously, on the carbon tax portion of it, the cap and trade in the Ontario context, but they are basically going to apply a carbon tax to heavy emitters. Is that really, totally abdicating the responsibility?
Every province is going to put forward some activity that they're going to do to help reduce emissions. The fact is, the plan that we've seen under Doug Ford has been one of doing less than the previous government was doing. At this point in our history, we need to be more ambitious and we need to be taking serious action. The center of this case, of course, revolves around our authority to implement a price on pollution. We've really just told provinces we want to set a minimum standard that we hope you can achieve. We know that the most effective thing we can do to transition to a low-carbon economy is to put a price on pollution. So to ask provinces to do the bare minimum is not too large a stretch in my mind.
Their argument, though, is that the onus is disproportionately on them. I mean, they've reduced the targets from where Kathleen Wynne set them. They've put them to basically mirror what the federal ones are, the Paris targets, that is. And they're saying, well, you're just expecting us to do more while other provinces can do less. And that is inherently unfair. What do you make of that?
It's not just Ontario that's taken serious steps in the past. I know in my home province, across different parties that were in government in Nova Scotia, there's been serious progress, but that doesn't justify doing less in the future. The fact is the Paris Agreement doesn't have subnational targets for provincial jurisdictions. It has national targets that we've committed to. We're going to need to have everybody get behind a plan to reduce emissions if we're going to hit those targets and avoid the most serious consequences that we know are coming from the very well-respected reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is serious and we have to take action, and we have to take action now.
Your government has come out criticizing the provincial government in Ontario for their radio ads and stickers that talk about the federal carbon tax. Aren't you also, though, sending out postcards that extol the virtues of your carbon pricing scheme?
We want to make sure that we're giving Canadians the information they have to understand the policies that we're putting forward. The fact is, most families who are in jurisdiction where this plan applies are going to be better off at the end of the year. To slap a $10,000 fine on the owner of a gas station who doesn't put forward propaganda from a provincial government is not only inappropriate and asking them to put forward misleading information, it's a huge stretch from a party that purports to protect free speech to mandate speech of the private sector. At the same time that they're going through a great exercise and spending money to put this propaganda out there, they've set aside $30 million at a time where they're making cuts, firing teachers, eroding the quality of health care in their province, and they have $30 million to spend to fight for their right to do less on climate change. It's unbelievable to me.
Why are their stickers propaganda and your postcard not?
Because they're misleading. What they're trying to do is tell Canadians that the cost of living is going up, when in fact they know that the climate action incentive is going to leave most families better off at the end of the day.
Does your postcard specify that it will leave 7 of 10 Canadians better off, but not 3?
Certainly, I've never tried to suggest that every single person is going to be better off. Of course, it depends on the
Does your postcard say that?
consumption.
You're saying that their stickers are misleading because they don't talk about the rebate. Do your postcards paint the full picture as well?
Sorry, I'm not sure about the specific detail on the postcard, but we're not mandating that they go up from privately owned gas stations.
Fair point.
To the extent that we want to make sure that people living in provinces like Ontario and New Brunswick and the other jurisdictions where the plan applies, we want to make sure that people know that there's a component to this plan where money's returned. We're not going to go out there and mandate that everyone shout from the rooftops. This is what the government's doing, particularly when the Ontario government is doing it in a misleading way.
Is there a cost to taxpayers associated with the mailing and the production of those postcards?
There's a cost to all things. I don't have the data in front of me. Of course, anything like that I expect would be quite modest. But the fact is, and if you look at the advertising of government programs over the past few years since the last election, it's a small fraction of what governments have historically been spending in recent years in Canada. The idea is that we want to make sure people understand the policies that are going to have more money coming into their pockets at the end of the year. And I'll make no apologies to ensure that Canadians understand how they can take advantage of programs that's going to reduce their tax burden and put more money in their pockets.
Before I let you go, let me move a couple provinces out to the west and ask you, now that there is a newly elected or incoming Premier, Jason Kenney, who has promised to get out or basically get rid of the province's carbon tax scheme or carbon pricing scheme. At what point does your government or will your government impose the federal carbon price on that province?
When it becomes clear that they're not willing to do the minimum standard that the law requires. I spent a few years in Alberta.
Isn't that clear already?
Sorry, what's that?
Isn't that clear already? I mean, he's made very specific promises.
Certainly, they made promises. If the province of Alberta implements a plan that fails to meet the criteria of the federal legislation, then the federal backstop is going to apply in that province. I should take this opportunity to congratulate Mr. Kenney on his election win and to thank Ms. Notley for her record of service over the past few years. I know we all have difference of opinions, but we're all in here to serve the public interest. But in my mind, serving the public interest includes fighting climate change. And to the extent that a Conservative government in Alberta under Mr. Kenney refuses to do the bare minimum that we know we should be doing, we will implement a federal system in that province.
So he says the third week of May, the first piece of legislation he'll introduce is the one that repeals the provincial carbon tax. Does that mean right after that you can impose, the federal government will impose the federal carbon tax? I
anticipate it will. I don't have a hard and fast date by which we're going to declare that it's in effect, but I can tell you in every province, not just Alberta, that fails to meet the minimum standards set out by this legislation, the federal government will step in. The fact is, climate change is real, it's a national concern, and pollution doesn't know where provincial borders start and end. We have to take action, and I'm convinced that the federal legislation is a meaningful step in that direction.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Fraser. Nice
to
see you.
pleasure.
Appreciate your time. That's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Sean Fraser.